So my name's Lauren Saunders. I'm a Hull-based artist and co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of The Critical Fish, which is an artist-led printed and online journal, magazine, project, and collective of artists, writers and academics and researchers that promote critical but accessible writing, and by extension thinking about art. So Creative Hull, which has been produced by Absolutely Cultured, is a weekend-long cultural event celebrating local talent, and we've been commissioned by them to produce and deliver Fishbowl Conversations, which is a participatory project encouraging critical and creative conversations about the artwork shared across the weekend. We've also put on 3 workshops as part of this offer, and this one's the first one. I'm going to pass you over to Barnaby. I'm very pleased to pass you over to him. He's not only a senior lecturer in American arts at Hull University, but he's a very valued Critical Fish editor as well, and just a general top bloke. So Barnaby, if you're ready to rock and roll, I shall pass the spotlight to you.
Thanks very much, Lauren, and good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming along. It's really good to see you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen in a minute, and I'm going to do a little presentation. So the first part of this will be me presenting, and then we can have a discussion after that. So I just wanted to show you a lot of really interesting works, past and present, which engage with this theme of critical history, but specifically around the representation of race. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. So hopefully we can see the slide. Can we just quickly nod our heads if you can see it all right? So I can just, yes, thank you very much. Okay, great. So, okay. So what I'm going to do is just basically start off with an introduction, thinking about history of art and history of art as a critical history. So thinking of art as a critical history about artists engaging as much with the past as the present, thinking about how artists explore the past, but with particular focus on this theme of race. So I'm going to be talking primarily about African American artists, past and present. So that'll be the first part. In the second part, we can have a discussion about this. Got a few questions, and then at that point, I'll come out of the sharing mode so we can see each other, and we can just go through some various points, what you think of the works, what you think of this idea about art being a form of critical history, how that might relate to your interests, what stories have been told, whose stories should be told. I'm thinking about Hull, but of course we can go beyond that, whatever you think is relevant, and perhaps to propose other stories to tell. So the second part will be much more back and forth. The first part is going to be me just showing you images and just talking through them. There's quite a lot of material, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. So at the moment we are in a situation where the culture wars seem to be making a regular appearance in the newspapers, the war on wokeness, wokeness as a monstrosity, to quote some of the newspaper coverage. We've been seeing a lot in the newspaper about gesture politics in relation to the football. It seems that this has been a talking point for a number of years, and we can think about how in this country the removal of statue of Robert Milligan, the Scottish slave owner, or the city father of Bristol, Edward Colston, getting chucked into the harbour as really pivotal moments in this rethinking of British history. I'm going to be talking about American history because that's my main focus and research interest. So we can see similar events happening in the United States, the toppling of statues of Confederate leaders or even Christopher Columbus. As America's memorials are, let's say, reevaluated at this moment where there seem to be profound tensions around race, whether it's related to what we could see the legacies of segregation, violence, manifested most famously in the murder of George Floyd, or the continuing difficulties of native peoples. And we can see statues getting toppled, statues getting removed, a process of revision and rethinking of these memorials in public spaces, and what it means to have a memorial in a public space which is, in a sense, a sign of a past history, a tribute to a past history. What does it mean to have Robert E. Lee standing in a southern city? And you can see how artists in a broadest sense, activists, as well as sort of visual culture, material culture practitioners in general, responding to these statues. So here's a statue of Robert E. Lee before it was taken down, with a rainbow flag sort of projected onto it, with Black Lives Matter iconography, and the way that this statue becomes both a symbol of the past, but also the revision, the activist attack on that legacy. So these are just some various scenes which have been in the news in the last couple of years, and then the sort of the type of memorial which is a counter memorial, if you will. So Kehinde Wiley, who is an artist who has painted Barack Obama, very celebrated New York-based artist, writing here about a part of his work. Sorry, this part of his name has been unfortunately sort of incorrectly listed there, but thinking about how this statue of a black rider in Richmond, Virginia offers a response to that particular legacy. The statue was initially unveiled in Times Square, and to think about how these different locations start to affect its meaning is really important. So this statue here is, in a sense, a monumental equestrian statue which takes on the type of iconography of people like Robert E. Lee, the Confederate leader, general, in a very evocative way. An analogous work would be Simone Lee's Brick House on the High Line in New York City, which is a more general, perhaps poetic treatment to the legacies of American racism, and particularly is experienced by African American women. So this brick house, this monumental piece, 16 feet high, on the High Line, standing there at an intersection, in a sense, a sort of an intersectional piece, but also a different type of, very modern type of memorial. So this brings me to, broadly speaking, a slightly more humble work, but it connects to critical fish and to some of my interests. So this is a mural by an artist in Alabama called Don Howard, an African-American artist, who was commissioned by the city of Scottsboro to produce a mural about the infamous Scottsboro case, which I will sort of talk about in a minute, but just in brief, 9 teenage African-Americans arrested on the charge of rape on a freight train, 1931, were very nearly lynched, were very nearly executed, spent many years in prison for a crime that never happened. It was a completely invented charge. Shown here, sort of overlooking Scottsboro with this modern day unity march, a prayer march. You can see by the masks there to locate it in the present. in Scottsboro. So this sort of multiple scene at the centre of the figures in the middle, Sam Leibowitz, their lawyer, you can see the judge and the sheriff who stop them getting lynched. So this is a really interesting mural in the main because it's shown in Scottsboro, Alabama itself. I'll show you some installation pictures in a minute, but I just wanted to draw attention to this theme of rewriting history. So I interviewed Don Howard for Critical Fish and wanted to connect this work in a discussion with what's going on in Bristol, the Colston statue. And what I was more or less saying is you know, there's this accusations of history being rewritten by the critics of these statues. And that history is somehow a sort of a solid edifice, like a memorial, and it can't be rewritten. Rather than thinking of history as a more fluid, dynamic process, which is always changing, and our past, a sense of a past changes accordingly. And what Don said was really interesting is the same question we are having here in the US regarding Civil War heroes. They want to remove certain monuments and statues with the same recurring theme while you're trying to rewrite history. It's a situation where you have to respect the fact that this is a historical champion to a certain element. Do you deny them the right to do that? We just don't believe they should be in public places like courthouses and other government agencies. It's like putting a statue of Mussolini or Hitler in a public space in London. So really just sort of feeling that statues of Robert E. Lee, etc., are essentially icons of a kind of American fascism in celebrating the legacy of the Confederacy. Which is a really interesting point of view. There's many points of the discussion that I had with Don about what it means to be a Black artist working in Alabama today, about how he engages with the sort of scenario we can think of as the George Floyd scenario, like sort of talking to his sons about what to do if you get pulled over by a policeman. What's really quite interesting is two things I found in this mural. One is that it's in Scottsboro itself. So the Scottsboro case is one of these, you know, central stories in the history of segregation, civil rights in the 1930s. There's a massive campaign about it in America, internationally, to try and get these teenagers out of prison, certainly off the electric chair. And obviously in Scottsboro, at the very heart of this case, there was a lot of hostility to that campaign, and it doesn't really need to be said, a considerable amount of antagonism to any African Americans who wanted to do other than exist in their lower state of quasi-slavery. So it's really important to have this there. But there are questions about it, which are very interesting. On the one hand, it is been commissioned by the city of Scottsboro to rebrand the city, so to engage with its past through telling this story, but perhaps on terms which are amenable to the city of Scottsboro. So there's a march in the front of the picture, but there's not really direct reference to sort of Black Lives Matter in that respect. More antagonistic elements, and also there is a sense of commercial opportunism going on here. But I think what's really at stake here is the nature of public art, and that, you know, there are many different questions involved, of course, but it's worth remembering that should this mural exist at all, painted by a Black artist, or should the artist have sort of turned it down, said it's a kind of compromise? That's really what is at stake in public art, is that this push and pull to get the message across. So an artist's uncritical history. Now here's a young artist from nearly 30 years ago, me. Believe it or not, I've really, in terms of my own personal history, I'm a relic. But what in my very brief tenure as an artist, one of the things I was asked to do as commission was for the North Atlantic, the Arctic Campaign Memorial Trust, in which celebrated the merchant ships going over to Russia, the Soviet Union, in the Second World War, and their contribution being repeatedly attacked by U-boats, very much the subject of Nicholas Montserrat's The Cruel Sea. And I was sort of commissioned to do this work. It's a memorial font. It's still used. I mean, thousands of babies must have been christened in it in a church in Devonport. But you know, I just took on the commission because I was asked to do it. And at the time, I sort of look back at it and think, was this really an uncritical history? What critical narratives could I engage with? You know, there is a sense of, in terms of engaging with public commissions, that the paymaster is ultimately sort of controlling the narrative. So I've often thought about this in my brief tenure as an artist, what it really means. And I suppose it provides a degree of sympathy towards any artist working in public, but there are limits perhaps. This is obviously an uncritical work, but I wouldn't say I'm ashamed of it as such. It doesn't engage with any necessarily contentious narratives, but nonetheless I'm aware of what it means to be an artist, engaging with histories, and the importance, I suppose, of being critical in historical engagement, which is something I'm not sure I really did. So I'm going to very briefly outline what it is that I do. I sort of moved into art history and what I think of as a form of critical art history. Funnily enough, very much engage with the relationship of American artists and the Soviet Union. So that transatlantic exchange, the transnational exchange, became hallmark of my research and the basis of a book that I wrote about artists going back and forth between America and the Soviet Union. And I was very much interested in art in a broad sense of exhibitions, books, magazines, newspapers, visual culture, an interdisciplinary idea, but also in the way that in these histories, when we look at what was going on in this interface of American and Russian artists, they're obviously very opposed to American racism, but there's many contradictions. A great example is a play by John Howard Lawson, Processional, against racism, in which all the actors were blacked up. It's that kind of contradiction at stake that interested me in looking back at America in the 1920s and 1930s. And since then, I've moved on to this narrative about the Scottsboro Nine. So the Scottsboro Nine, as I've said, these very unfortunate teenagers who were arrested in 1931 in Alabama. And just thinking about how the radical left, who engaged with the case through the defense organization, International Labor Defense, a communist organization which sought to get these teenagers out of jail, but in a very belligerent manner, used photography in their campaigns, particularly in the magazine Labor Defender, as a way of fostering their campaign through visual means. And this is basically the research I'm doing at the moment. I've got an article on the go, an academic article on this subject, funded by the British Academy, and I'm just doing a project which will be much more about local engagement with schools and communities through creative practice of a poster competition through the Farron's Education Trust. So in a sense, looking critically at the past. So just saying this to locate my interest with Don Howard's project. That's the Scottsboro Nine, and a photograph that I've been writing about quite a lot recently, the arrest photograph. Okay, so we can sort of see how, you know, photography can be really powerful. And this project, I'm just thinking about how this photograph gets used in different locations for or against the line. So you can see how captions load an image with all sorts of meaning. There's a Southern paper there, which essentially uses a photograph to say these people are guilty, and then a radical paper, Judge Lynch, goes to court to fight on their behalf. But both of them seize upon the sort of the abject situation of the arrested nine. So it's really interesting to try and connect this to the present. And I thought, you know, going back to Don's piece, it's an engagement with the past. It's critical to an extent, an important gesture, but at the same time, there are problems, you might say, in this form of representation. It'd be interesting to discuss this anyway. But what I want to do now is just to try and locate it and just to think about how the excuse me, image might sit in sort of broader histories. So one thing which really reminded me of what Don Howard was doing is this type of celebratory mural, which is very sort of particular in the history of African American modern art. So I found this very reminiscent, and Charles White, a radical artist working in the mid-century for the New Deal government in America during the Depression, creating this epic series of African American icons. And you can see how there's some multiple dynamisms in the composition. There's a sort of similarity in that respect. So I could see this sort of visual reception going on here. What White was doing in this piece was, in a sense, to answer the question, which is really embedded in American culture, is that somehow African American people don't have a sort of sophisticated culture or engagement with science. The logic of racism being a kind of innate inferiority, and to show this very powerful legacy of key figures such as the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, or the scientist George Washington Carver, in this one powerful scene in a piece which is commissioned by the government. So just thinking about how there are these alternative histories. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a few really interesting examples. I think this is a series by Aaron Douglas, which is in the Schomburg Center, which is the New York Public Library in New York, obviously in Manhattan, in Harlem. I did some research there a couple of years ago, and the mural panels are in the library. It's really fantastic to sort of sit there and do research and see these pieces. So Douglas is a really interesting figure, born in Kansas. He moved to Harlem in the 1920s. He very much became the artist of what was known as the Harlem Renaissance, which was a meeting of writers and artists with engagement with modernism in culture and powerful attack on racism in America. So sort of very positive, but quite forward-thinking African American art practice. He was the illustrator of a magazine called Fire, which has this sort of sense of militancy about it. It's really interesting experimental piece, and Alan Knox volume, The New Negro. He was also a radical artist engaged with the Popular Front in the 1930s, anti-fascism, later became an art teacher at Fisk University. Just a few details about Douglas there, and just to think about how he created this visual language, which became very much the sign of the Harlem Renaissance. You could see this particular form of these silhouetted figures, referring to hieroglyphics, to also to Cubism simultaneously, to get something which is modern American, and also in a broader sense you could think of as Art Deco, but particularly related to this specific moment in Harlem. So one of the things that these artists and writers were doing with this notion of a new Negro was to counteract the stereotypical view of the so-called old Negro, which is one of the best ways of understanding this is to think about how at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, really major world fair in 1893, attended by millions of people. You can see there's a court of honor. It was known as White City, both colloquially but also critically, in relation to its greater celebration of white culture. One of the exhibits was this real life sort of human exhibit of villages from Dahomey, which people could go and look at. So the World's Fair magazine put together a Negro Day parade with the Dahomey village in this caricature here, which relies on all those stereotypes of pickaninnies that define caricature of Black people in America and in this country, of course. So this is really what they're working against. So you can see hang on a minute, how, for example, a program of redress goes on with the pioneering civil rights leader W.B. Du Bois, who wrote in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk, really how African Americans couldn't be seen as a separate part of American history. We have fought their battles, their sorrow mingled our blood with theirs, and generation after generation have pleaded with a headstrong, careless people, despise not justice, mercy, truth, lest the nation be smitten with a curse. Would America have been America without a Negro people? And one of the ways he riposted was through visual means. So at a similar World's Fair several years later in Paris, he created this series of photographs, an exhibit called the Exhibition of American Negro, with a lot of images of African Americans taken by African American photographers such as Augustus Washington, Thomas Askew, a very positive image, what he called the talented 10th. So back to Douglas again, you could see how an image like this is really important. It's a work which is commissioned by the Public Works of Art Project, an early New Deal public art body in the Harlem New York Public Library, telling the story of African American history, creating this sort of critical historical narrative with these forms from the African setting interlinked through various devices, such as these sort of really fascinating force lines you can see with musical effects, sort of drum beats, and then the sort of banjo, as if it's a kind of synesthetic picture. It's a sort of visual image, but you can sort of hear the changing, shifting tonal patterns of music from the drum beat to the folk music of the Deep South. And you can see the sort of a moment of change of the emergent abolitionism of civil rights. If you look at the top left figure, you can see the sort of hooded Klansman aiming to stop any progress, and the escape to Harlem signified here by the Song of the Towers. You can see the jazz saxophonist being analogized with the Statue of Liberty. So I'm just moving on to another artist. In a sense, the Harlem Renaissance was very celebratory, but by the mid-1930s, a lot of people felt that in the Depression, where African Americans had got one of the worst deals of the lot, and there was considerable poverty and unemployment in Harlem, that the Harlem Renaissance had been very positive and optimistic, but it somehow not really built on its promise. An artist of the next generation, whose family came to New York from the South, hired by the Works Progress Administration, Jacob Lawrence, produced works at the Harlem Community Arts Center and these epic cycles of American history. What's interesting about Lawrence is he has this, as you can see from that picture of Eviction, a much more abrasive style, a much more confrontational. And it's often sort of thought of as a sense of a riposte to the Harlem Renaissance. A sense of this optimism might have been a bit premature or misplaced, and a far more critical, antagonistic line shown in his pictures. So one of the most interesting series that he did is a panel called The Great Migration, telling the story of African Americans moving to the cities from the South. He was very much taken up by the Museum of Modern Art as their main Black artists. There is a sense of tokenism. Black artists, like women artists, have been historically massively underrepresented at the Museum of Modern Art during its long history since the 20s, as in many other museums. And this is just a photo I took of this series. But what I find really interesting about Lawrence is this very pared down use of form to create this form of narrative visual means, a folk idiom, which is sort of modern, but it draws from the sort of deconstructed quality of modernist painting, sort of post-cubism in a way, but has something which seems a bit more vernacular to it. Some people find this is just very, very simplistic and in fact sort of not very sophisticated. I personally would disagree. I think these very strong, powerful sense of unity of composition and colour. And if you go back to the original taken together, they have this sense of this episodic narrative. So you can see this sort of history being told through these scenes, a different form, more critical, if you will, than Douglas. Again, sort of the legacies of lynching. So just showing, there's obviously 60 panels. I'm just showing you a few rather than the whole lot. An artist who is, you could comfortably say, a veteran artist, Faith Ringgold, 90, is I would define as an artist whose work is really concerned with critical histories. So Ringgold emerged in the 1950s and developed a career properly in the 1960s, was involved in a couple of really important groups. One was the sort of Black Women's Artists, Inc., so raising the profile of African-American women artists, by far sort of the least represented in galleries and museums, certainly then. And also the Radical Art Workers Coalition, which was engaged with a number of things, anti-Vietnam War being one of its main campaigns. So a really interesting meeting of radical positions. He's also the mother of Michelle Wallace, one of the leading pioneers of intersectionality in critical theory. You can see Ringgold depicted there. And Ringgold's take on the America of the 1960s is one of great violence. So the piece, which I'd say is really fascinating, critical history of the United States of Attica, shows the American flag with African-American flag colours of black, red and green in response to the massacre at Attica prison of over 40 inmates during very violent suppression of a prison riot, which in New York State was under the jurisdiction of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who the Rockefeller family is sort of one of the leading founders of the Museum of Modern Art. So this is a very critical gesture about the organization in one respect, but also about these histories. And you can see how histories of slavery, of colonial warfare are sort of meted out through this picture, a map of American violence. So I'm just sort of moving on to a younger contemporary artist and a different focus here to Carrie Mae Weems, who is, I find, a fascinating artist who's engaged primarily with photography, but you could say he's a mixed media, sort of intermediate artist working on a number of fronts, based in Syracuse. Started out as a dancer, had a child very relatively young. In the late 1970s, started exhibiting in some very important photography auspices, the Black Photographers Annual being one of them, producing a series of photographs about a family, but also images of African-American history. And one of the things she does in this project, which is called the Louisiana Project, is a kind of type of documentary fiction in which she shows herself depicted walking through a Louisiana mansion, the sort of the big white house. Anyone who's been watching the Underground Railroad adaptation of Colson Whitehead's fantastic novel, and it's a very harrowing adaptation on TV, which I fully recommend, will have a sense of a particular experience of African American women within the slave environment, within the plantation and so forth. So shown here, sort of wandering freely through this environment in this very powerful, imaginative way, both in the present and the past simultaneously, in a dramatic recreation, but also a kind of ghost, doing things which would be clearly forbidden, and yet it's a sort of a poetic exploration of this space, a reclaiming of a space, but also a reimagining of it. There's something about this project which speaks to themes which have been in important African-American novels, beloved by Toni Morrison, perhaps the most famous example, but one which really strikes me is Octavia Butler's Kindred, in which an African-American woman in 1970s suddenly sort of vanishes from her time and reappears in this plantation environment, and then just sort of moves back and forth between the present and the past. Really recommend that book, and I can see a sort of a parallel with what Butler does. So moving, it's going to take us a bit sort of closer back to Britain, starting off, of course, in the United States. Kara Walker, I think, is again an artist who engages with these legacies, has a critical history which uses these poetic, imaginative means in lots of different ways. So these are just a few details about Walker. I won't go through them all, but what really fascinates me is how she uses collage, silhouettes, sculpture, shadow puppets, these forms of culture, visual culture, which are concerned with sort of the imagination, with sort of fantastical, but also provide a space for exploring these histories of stereotypes, gender identity, histories of slavery and segregation. So you can see, for example, an image like this silhouette here. It has this quality of a focus silhouette, those sort of silhouettes which you'd find in early 19th century newspapers were called blackies, which shown here is a sort of, it's a strange kind of doubling of a sort of a body with two heads, a sort of mask-like folk narrative here, but engaging with the sort of the psychological dimension. So what's really interesting, in 2019, Walker was commissioned to do the prestigious and much coveted Turbine Hall installation project, which she did. I believe it's still there. I mean, I haven't checked recently, but because of the current situation, it was supposed to have been removed in early 2020, but it's kept on site. So please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but as I imagine it's still in situ, the Fons Americanus, which again uses this sort of archaic presentation, has a sense of the sort of a circus, but also the sort of historical tract, a giant fountain exploring sort of transatlantic slavery cargo, but also the sort of the epic statuary which defines British Empire. So you can see some of these iconographies being reconsidered and mobilized into this sort of giant statue, which engages too with figures like the slave rebel Toussaint Louverture, with Marcus Garvey, the sort of Back to Africa movement. So a sort of a complex set of narratives in this giant piece, which deals with these serious stories, but also in a very imaginative way, with humor as well as bite. Now, what interests me, and I think this is part of just thinking about art as critical history, is one of, there's quite a bit of text here, but I do apologize, but I think it's quite useful, is to think about how sort of critical response. So Rhianna Jade Parker, writing in Art News, made this really trenchant critique of a work, which I thought just sort of would give us something to chew over and to think about how something which, when I saw the Fons Americanus, I was sort of blown away, and I thought this is a really major, important, fascinating piece of work. And you know, I've been an admirer of Walker's for quite some time. But just to think about how it, in bringing this work to the United Kingdom and relocating this very effective and pioneering aesthetic and program in general, Walker has been, very much leading the reconsideration of the legacy of slavery and segregation through visual culture. In a sense, one of the forerunners of the arguments that we're dealing with now. But Parker says, the commissioning of Fons Americanus as a counter memorial to colonial public monuments is unconvincing because it fails to do what any good statue should deal with its site and the context surrounding it. And Parker takes quite a critical line at this comment that Walker made to The Guardian. From my perspective, the UK always seemed a fairly advanced place to be Black and British, get a good education, have a good vocabulary, and not have this legacy of systematic violence and educational economic oppression, which is sort of very much central to many of these artworks that I've been talking about. But going back to Parker, she says, in the wake of Windrush scandal, amongst other things, Walker's sentiments expose a disappointing and offensive lack of understanding that would allow for such a flattening of British life and history. Walker has done nothing to wrestle with the history, rather, of Tate's founder, the sugar merchant, Sir Henry Tate, who many have said profited from the employment of slaves. So you get this sort of very powerful sense of what happens when these arguments shift and the locations move. And I'm not saying that either Walker or Parker are right in this argument. I think it's a really interesting argument, and it just shows some of the problems which I was talking about before with the Scottsboro piece by Don Howard, which is very important, but it's incomplete in a way for reasons which are understandable, but nonetheless we can think about critically. So anyway, just to sort of round things off, Parker does give us a sort of a model, the British artist Hugh Locke, sort of born in Edinburgh, I believe, who has engaged critically with the legacies of British imperial history, but also on site in America. So it sort of returns the argument to an extent, and how Locke sort of addressed the past through this sort of embellishment of memorials in the United States to Governor of New York City, Peter Stuyvesant, or J. Marion Sims, who sort of experimented on slaves. So really recreating, and how Locke, with this really powerful series, speaks to the entire American story, the Song of the South, mixed media series. He takes Confederate bonds and draws over them and sort of reinterprets them, but reappropriates them, I suppose, and says perhaps the most prominent reminder that certain truths have been lost to a mythic forgetfulness is the motif of Washington on horseback at the top of these antique documents. And I thought that quote really struck me, this phrase, lost to a mythic forgetfulness. I sort of wonder if that could be considered in relation to many of the statues that I've been showing at the start, statues in Britain, statues in America, this sort of forgetfulness that the past becomes absorbed into the everyday as part of the past, and in a sense, sometimes in a very minor way, or sometimes in a very considerable way, in the case of Robert E. Lee, is a validation of the past, and why this argument about memorials is so important. Okay, so that's just to conclude what I wanted to say. Quite a lot to show you, I'm afraid. So what we're going to do is just, I'm going to pause for a moment and take a swig of water, if you don't mind. Just go through some questions. I'm going to come out of the share mode and going to put these into the chat box. I'm going to show you what we can talk about now. What I'm of course interested is what you thought of these works, what interested you about them, what these artists are doing, and I fully appreciate that some you might have enjoyed more than others. And this question is, should art be a form of critical history? Is it? Is it often what do you make of that? And another question is, what else is interesting about the works other than just say their engagement with the past? So those are some of the things. And then just afterwards, we can think about something more local, what and whose stories have been told or should be told about artists, by artists about Hull's past, or the region, or if you're not based in Hull, wherever you're from, what are the stories you think aren't being told or have been told well? You know, that's a question. What stories would you tell? So to give a sense of engagement there. So stop share. Okay. Just bear with me a moment.
Are people okay? Know how to unmute themselves if they want to chat. If you're not sure, put your hand up, or I can unmute you from here if it's easier.
Sorry, just bear with me one moment. What I'm doing is I'm just what I like to do is I should have done this before, I do apologize, is just to paste the questions one by one into the chat. So I was just wondering if anyone's got any thoughts about any of the work. I mean, there's so many of them, but it felt to me like quite a sort of quite a sample of anything rather than a comprehensive. I mean, there's so many that there could have been, but I was wondering if anyone had any sort of immediate responses to any of them. Okay. Well, maybe that will come through as we start to, I mean, please. Oh, Richard, thanks. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay. That piece in the Tate Modern, I think the last time I went to London just before COVID hit with a vengeance, I found was really very interesting. And the quote that you from the artist about black people in Britain have it easy, essentially, is that what she was saying? It kind of reflects a lot of ignorance, and you know, I don't know all this about all the history of African American struggles in America, and you know, clearly she didn't, because you know, just scratching beneath the surface, you look at the institutionalized racism in the police, you look at the deaths in police custody, you look at stop and search, and you look at what the government tried to do with the Windrush, you know, in the Windrush scandal, where you know, West Indian Brits were targeted in the most crudely racist fashion, and it does reflect, I think, a degree of ignorance, and also it was very interesting as well. One of the things I think about when I go to the Tate is that, you know, Tate is based on sugar money, and sugar is plantation money, and it's part of a process whereby you know, art and art institutions are sponsored by people who want to launder their money, basically. Is it called art washing, where you kind of like launder your in the same way that Colston did lots of good work in Bristol, you know, for the white poor, for the underprivileged, you know, and yet his money was based on the ruthless murder and exploitation of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. So interesting to point out the contradictions. So I was quite interested in that as also very interested in the fact, Barnaby, that you were an artist. That font was quite quite a revelation, really.
Yeah, well, you know, thanks. I think I'd sort of be slightly exaggerating my own capabilities and achievements to I'd say was an artist seems like a like a fairly accurate description there, but it struck me as an interesting way of just sort of, I wanted to, it's easy to sort of be in a situation where you can sort of assess and judge artists, but one of where I come from as an art historian is knowing sort of the limitations and to an extent failings as an artist that I experienced, and what it entails to a degree in particular ways, but not in any sense of universal understanding. But I think there are contradictions in play in how works can be, on the one hand, compelling and powerful, but also is this sense of incompleteness, and can there be a tribute to the past which does justice for everyone in that respect. But thank you. Any other thoughts about that particular issue? Hi, Glynis, please.
Yeah, thank you, Barnaby. It was I have seen a lot of those artists before. Yeah, I think Richard's point is really interesting, because I think it shows the lack of information that, you know, I mean, there was information passing between the slave community, or the in regards to you know, freeing, you know, like abolishing slavery, but there wasn't the same, because people got, you know, how did people end up in Britain, and it's mainly from the West Indies, which so in America people went to North America, or so everybody was quite separate. And I think there is a lack of understanding, because Americans are very different from the British. But there have been, what it made me think of was people like Claudia Jones and James Baldwin and other people who moved from America to other countries as well, and then had because you mainly focused on American artists rather than British. But if you look at the British Black artists, you'll find there's more. Well, I'm not sure actually, because American artists have been very prolific, and I think the Harlem Renaissance really was a sort of quite a productive period for Americans, and they had a really oppressive history, yes, but I think when people came to Britain, it was the same thing, but it hasn't been you know, out there as much. But I think there was more political, and because people were trying, I mean, look at the Black Panther movement. I mean, when that came in the 70s, it was more about feeding people, you know, because people have been poor. So, and the people that ended up being artists were probably part of the more middle classes who were able to access an education. Meanwhile, the vast majority of African Americans remained, you know, on a very low level. So these are people who are interacting with the powers that be, and actually being employed by them, which I mean, if you're being offered a commission, that commission was going to feed more than just you. It's going to feed your whole family, your whole community. And this is the situation that artists have had. You find very few Black people going into art education in Britain, because there's no money, there's not necessarily money in it, you know, because so I think most African Americans and most British Afro-Caribbean Africans have been focused on trying to earn a living. So it's the very few people can concentrate on being artists. So there's a whole political history that's there in terms of an artwork produced because of it. Alice Walker, in her novel In Search of Her Mother's Gardens, has an essay in it saying about the revolutionary artist, because there is this issue: if you're Black, do you put your you know, and it is a problem with the art institutions, because if your work isn't black enough, sometimes you're not considered. So it really focuses you on producing political work rather than, you know, white artists don't necessarily have to think about this unless they're from an oppressed minority like Irish. Well, they're not minority, but Irish people have often done political work. The Russian constructivist, the German, you know, with the East German situation, you know, people like, who did I study? Richard Hartfield, who did montages about Nazism in the 40s, 30s.
Yeah.
And so you've got that, you know, because when you talk about art, is it art for, you know, what does art mean? And every black artist that produces art, there's always a political issue with it. So, and that thing about ignorance, yes, Americans are often ignorant of British black history because they haven't had access to it. And so we get it told to us by white academics, actually often. So, but there are people in Britain, you know, like Sonia Boyce and Keith Piper. There was a whole group in the 80s that produced some really good work here, but it was very political work, you know, because the 80s was a very political time in Britain with the Thatcher years. So, and Eddie Chambers, people like that. But yeah, I think it's quite an important point.
Thank you very much. I mean, you know, there's so much going on there, and it is really interesting to think about this disparity of the American and the British, but also historically how those were sort of connected, and just sort of Frederick Douglass touring Ireland and Britain being sort of one example, and there was this sort of link up, but clearly there was a sense of sort of discontinuity in Walker's thinking about it. It is really interesting to that question you made about the expectation of black artists. In that respect, a different, you know, very particular situation, which is obviously sort of troubling at the same time as it is a sort of an opportunity, I suppose. I'm not quite sure how to frame that, but it's very interesting to think about that way. Yeah, John Hartfield, that's someone who I've certainly come across and would be connected to that sort of radical culture of the interwar years. I find one of the things that the reason I'm drawing attention to this is that for all its problems, that radical culture is very much my work at the moment, and I think it how much phrase this quite the right way. The point you made about sort of white academics sort of telling these stories, I think is a really crucial one, and one of the things I'm trying to sort of get over is that my take on it is in relation to this communist culture, that it is about this particular problem, which is, on the one hand, it was the communists in the 1930s, and John Hartfield was a German communist who was connected up with in this international movement, who were the most vociferous antagonists against American racism, certainly in terms of activism and militancy. On the other hand, what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, I don't think any of us would hold up as a sort of as a crowning achievement. I mean, it's sort of, you know, often framed as genocide, and particularly in relation to the treatment of prisoners in forced labor camps and so on. So you get the situation. There's a really interesting scenario I'm working out at the moment in relation to the visual depiction of black radicals, particularly this guy Angelo Herndon in the 1930s, and what that sort of tells us about that interface, you know, communist African Americans and the sort of particular complications. But going back to the original point is the link up is that there was a magazine called The Negro Worker, which would look at the situation in South Africa, would look at the sort of the Caribbean, look at America and Britain, and connect all these things up. And it seemed to have this international dialogue. But of course, it was funded and enabled by a regime which sort of truly horrific in its actions, and quite opportunistic in its mobilization of the attack, the war against racism. I mean, it's quite cynical at times. So that's a bit of a sort of a roundabout way of just trying to explain sort of where I'm coming from here, but also to think about the international conversations. That's right. I mean, sorry, in the chat box, so Lauren has said it's a sort of, going back to Glynis's point, that it's a sort of a disability art, a pressure to produce work about disability, and that identity becomes the prominent factor, as you were saying, Glynis, in a way that sort of perhaps a white artist, would be, well, just do what you want. You can go where you want. There's a sort of a sense of complete freedom. Great. So this is more of a question, I suppose, to anyone who's engaged in practical art. Do you think of art as a form of critical history? Slightly leading, so I mean, I have to admit, Richard, I do know a little bit as someone producing work which does have a sort of critical historical engagement. And I do apologize if I'm not so familiar with any other artists here. But what does anyone think about this notion that art is should be? I think, did Richard have your hand up first? I think you're still muted, thank you.
Am I there? Am I unmuted?
You are now, thanks.
Okay, good. All right. Okay. I'm a socialist. I'm a printmaker, and at the end, I've got to share about what might be interesting in terms of a local artistic things going on. I've got something to share there, but for me, I try and think as art, not just as political, as critical history, but as political history. And even if it's not, if it's not overt, or you can read the whole of art as reflecting something about what was going on at the time and the power balance at the time. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned about the these public memorials and statues that was happened in in terms of Robert E. Lee statues in the southern states being I mean, obviously they were a symbol, they're a symbol of white supremacy, but it's been very interesting in Hull when Black Lives Matter movement took off. And there were big meetings in Queen's Gardens. I think it was a second meeting, so that'd be June last year. That there was false propaganda put out that Black Lives Matter were going to attack the memorial in Paragon Square, and a lot of right wingers, also some people from some ex-servicemen, were persuaded that they had to defend that statue. Now, it was total, it was false propaganda that people coming together to show solidarity with Black Lives Matter and to show solidarity in the resistance to institutionalized racism and to show their support for justice for George Floyd, those people were going to attack a monument to the dead of Hull. So it was part of a culture war, part of a very nasty culture war. And so, I mean, these struggles are here with us in this city as they are nationally. But I would say that, I mean, I'm interested in traditions in radical culture. Glynis mentioned John Hartfield and the German expressionists and Russian constructivists. In terms of printmaking, I mean, you'll know Barnaby, the New Deal printmakers like Lind Ward in America. They had an overt political agenda, but I do think those artists who who are not overt. So you can look at them, you can read them as a reflection of political history. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that when we look at, if we go to the Ferens, for instance, and look at the Dutch masters, and the permanent collection there, we're looking at essentially a kind of a rich families, the Ferens families trophy cabinet, and we're allowed to go into it. And that's probably been taken over by municipal funding for the Ferens, obviously. But so you can look at the institutions of art from a political point of view as well. So yeah, I can kind of leave it there, throw that one in and see what people think.
I think, because I used to work at the art college, so I used to see a lot of students coming through. The Ferens is concerned with sort of old, masters, and it's not really a contemporary, although it does have contemporary exhibitions sometimes. But some of the artists I came across at the college, say, painted where they were. So, in Hull, you have got different areas of Hull. You've got some areas that are considered sort of working class and deprived. And it was interesting that artists from those areas depicted their own environments, often in a sculptural way as well. There was one particular guy, and I can't remember his name now, but he really, so you could say that if you're just depicting your life as you know it within an environment, that is political, because you could say the personal. And one of the things I got from, because I used to live in London and I've lived in Leeds as well, is the personal as a political thing. And that came through the women's movement as well, where as a woman, your life is continuously governed by rules of, say, patriarchy, which is also connected to, imperialism and colonialism. And so as a woman, you're constantly living under the threat of, being attacked. And your dress as well, you're sort of controlled how you dress and things like that. Not in an overt way, because I'd say here we're quite liberal in Britain, but it doesn't stop women being attacked, So if we were an Islamic country and we were covered up, I don't think that actually stops you being attacked either. But there are issues around. I know that if I look at a piece of work that's been done by a woman, there's definitely issues about women being a woman in that work. And so I think everything is political in a sense. You could say, and it's also about looking at the paintings. Like when I look at the paintings, the Dutch masters, for instance, you see these amazing perspectives and space, and it takes you to another place of where are these buildings, what are they for? So everything in the Ferens, even though it might be an imperial thing, it's like my favorite painting in there is the I don't know, it's been done by Lady Butler, because she's also got a painting in the Leeds Art Gallery, which is those soldiers, and actually it's all staged. She wasn't actually on. She actually hired all the actors in and then painted it, but it is a painting of people returning from a battle. So again, you've got the context of the battle, the field, the wounded men, and things like that in it. So that is political again. Because what war was that? That was the first. No, it's the Crimean War. It's one of those Boer wars that were fought before. But in Hull, there's I think there's a lot of radical artists fighting against the system, because and I think that's Hull has always been Labour, and it's had a history of being resistant to the kings and queens that have tried to sort of get their foot in Hull, sort of thing. So we have a Beverley Gate here, which was the point where what was his name? King Charles II was refused entry because he wanted to come and rifle the arse. He wanted to get all the arms from Hull to fight his battles. So yeah, I think there is a political, but art is always a form of critical history because it's situated where it is produced. So even if it's pretty pictures, it's still, you could say, it's still a political issue.
I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, there's an artist I really like who's very much sort of at the forefront of the communist movement in the 40s in America, called Joseph Solomon. And you'd never know from his work because he sort of did still lives and studio paintings. And the point for him was, it was, you know, as he said, it's the organised, is where he exhibited his work. It's sort of how he sort of brought it to a public, the sort of galleries, and his activities, members of Artists Union, that kind of thing. So even if you're producing something which is still life, which you might think of as very potentially, I mean, I don't think this, but potentially very tame and safe format, it's very rich and there's a lot going on there. But it's a very much about sort of the context of production. So that is really interesting to think. I've got some questions about Hull in a bit. So I'd briefly sort of that point that Richard made about the museum is really important. So I'm talking about Faith Ringgold and Nelson Rockefeller. It's just that, you know, so Rockefeller money was from Standard Oil, and they just meddled around with Mexican politics, you know, backing the Porfirio Diaz, and then back moving to Francisco Madero and the revolution, just picking sides and sort of engaging with all sort of, you know, how many people were killed in the sort of Mexican sort of civil war, and Standard Oil had this important sort of role. And that was the Rockefeller money, and Rockefellers led the Museum of Modern Art. So it's always in this sort of form of contest and contestation. So interesting there. So Natasha's got her hand up, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the circumstances, the context in which somebody makes something. I sometimes look at the Dutch masters. I'm in Amsterdam, so I see some of the things that they paint. And but I look at the paintings and I think about who contributed to their time and made space for them to be able to develop those skills, and you know who's kind of not thought about, that created time and space for them to paint. So yeah, sort of adding to that that idea of context. So I don't see how you can separate that from.
Yeah, do you want to sort of build that a bit more? I mean, about who contributed, who gave them the time, and just sort of. Really,
well, in basic terms, like who made the food,
yeah,
who cleaned the house, who, you know, when you're busy, you know, and the absorption and the education, the apprentice. You know, I'm not a academic historian, so I don't have references for you, but in terms of just knowing how much time it takes to develop a skill and how much focus, yeah, and then the paints, where the paints came from and who dug them out of the earth, and you know, like when you begin to think about all the materials, yeah, that leads into many places. Never mind. Yeah.
Please do.
Never mind the colonial thing. Yeah.
But it is a really interesting way of thinking about the politics of art. I think I completely see what you mean. I mean, there's the sort of the politics of the art, the domestic politics of the artist, and the environment, you know, the supported artist on the one hand. And then there's the politics of the who gets, I'm not a sort of an expert on pigments, but who mines the pigments, you know, who's the person who transports the painting from the studio to the gallery on their cart. You know, that sort of, that's a politics of, that's a history, and there were political situations, and the relationship of the artist and the patron, we often think of as being a political relationship, but the artist as a sort of a patron of suppliers and creditors, and that is a really, you know, it's an interesting point of view. I was at a conference a while ago where someone was talking, it was about periodicals, and someone would say, well, we're talking about the artists, we're talking about the writers who produce all the content, but why is no one talking about the printers, you know, and the, you know, that side of it is the sort of the politics of the mechanics of these magazines. So I think, you know, that whole political story is, it's very, very complex, but yeah, I think that's.
I mean, one painter that really got me, actually, because there is an institute here called WISE, the Wilberforce Institute of Slavery and Emancipation. It's connected to Hull University, and they have some really interesting lectures. But they did a whole one on the Zong, which was the ship that threw slaves overboard to drown and then went to court to claim compensation because as you know, as property for being because they insured all their property, which included, you know, so people were included like animals, you know, and they lost the case. But Turner produced a picture of that, the Zong, and I watched the film of Turner, and it was one of the most powerful films I'd watched, actually, because it's a very beautifully shot film. And the event leading up to, he went and strapped himself to a ship and went out in a storm to get the feeling of what it was like to be chucked overboard. Well, he was lashed to the ship, but and to get the feeling of what it was like to be in the middle of a storm. So that picture is really important, really powerful. And also the film goes through what, because it's set in, I can't remember the dates, I'm not a historian either, but his father ground the pigments, and there was a whole lot of industry attached to being a painter, because you had to go and get the paints, you had to get canvas, you know, everybody, it employed a lot of people, that industry. Where now you just go and buy a tube of paint, which is artificially, it's synthetic. It's not made of real pigments. There's also a book called Color, which actually goes through where all the pigments used to come from. Red used to come from Afghanistan. So now, you know, it's very hard to get, you know, because some of the places where the actual pigments came from were inaccessible, really. So they were very hard to get. And then you've got blue, which is very hard to get as well, because it was lapis lazuli, wasn't it? It was a rock that was crushed up. And so some colors have been, and they've got indigo, because that's another issue as well, you know, the indigo trade and the, but yeah, it was just that film that was really important. Also, Turner turns out to be a bit of a slob, really, and a bit of a nasty man, but it does show you the whole context in which he painted, and also the patronage that happened. And this is white artist, you know, this is British artists, so that situation is very interesting as well, you know. But yeah, so I suppose your talk is more about sort of political art, isn't it? Critical. So
Banksy, I mean, I was thinking about it.
Banksy, yeah, we have Banksy here as well. We have had Banksy.
Yeah, Banksy's an interesting one. I mean, it's a kind of certainly sort of I teach art and visual culture to American studies students who, you know, not to art history students, and they're more familiar with Banksy than they are with any of the artists I teach. And that familiarity of Banksy in itself is one of the important features, which is not a sort of a defense or a critique of Banksy, but I think it's very interesting. Well, I think what you were saying there about is just like a history of colors, a colonial history or an imperial or even just an international trade history of pigments is a sort of a really interesting way of exploring this, and the materials that artists use. Now, one of the things that struck me when I was interviewing Don Howard growing up in Texas, in a pretty poor family, African-American family, growing up in the 1950s and 60s, was his mother sort of saving paper grocery bags. And that was his sort of material, you know, that was, and it was, you know, he's very much sort of thought, he sort of told the story as a sort of with a sense of affection, but also recognition that he didn't come from this background where he was expected to become an artist. And it was really through his own volition and energy that he did that. But it's just that sort of that sense of a material which was, you know, crucial in his formation as an artist, was what was to hand. So there is a kind of a politics of the materials in terms of availability, which I think is really really interesting in that regard. Very much so.
I mean, here in Hull, there's a lot of people who are interested in the idea of socially engaged art. So that whole idea of social engagement, engaging everybody, you know, engaging people to create, to get into the mode of anyone can be an artist as well. So I think that's, and public art as well, is, I think Hull has not really produced, I mean, Richard had an exhibition of his work, which was the anti-racist posters, which really came from London, actually, from the 1980s. But yeah, it is something that I don't, you know, yeah, it's difficult to see here in Hull, apart from the, you know, the marches, the Black Lives Matter things, and yeah.
Well, I mean, you sort of thanks. I mean, you're sort of leading me into one of the questions I actually want to ask, which really is about that. So it was a question, I'll just put the question as it was originally sort of phrased, but it doesn't really matter too much. I was just thinking about what and whose stories have been told or should be told. I mean, so Glynis, you said there is a sort of socially engaged art, and then there's a public art, and those things sort of overlap in a way, but they can sometimes be quite different. And you know, I mean, I suppose you could think of the original statue of Colston put together an agenda of tradesmen in the late 19th century to create this sort of civic icon as a sort of a form of public art. Whereas social, you know, so it's about that sort of that mixing of the two, where they sort of overlap, but they can also be at odds, which is a really interesting area to look at, think about. But I was just wondering, you know, because I'm, as you can probably guess, not from Hull, and I was just wondering what anyone thinks of these questions is are there sort of stories of the past, are there aspects of the past, or even whole sort of identity which just aren't getting told? Richard.
I think I wrote about this in edition 2 of Critical Fish. Can you hear me? Am I not muted? Yeah, okay. I mean, one of the absolutely soul-crushing disappointments of Hull City of Culture was the deliberate marginalisation of Hull's minority communities, ethnic communities. Mm-hmm. There was nothing for the Kurdish community. There was nothing for the Bangladeshi community. There was nothing for the Polish and Eastern European community, and nothing for the wider Muslim community in Hull. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Hull was a white town, when there were very few ethnic communities, and Hull was dying. Hull was depopulating. People were moving out of Hull into the West Hull villages, and the communities that have come in and revived Hull, or Beverley Road, Springbank, are migrant communities. And when Hull City of Culture was trying to get that status, there was a lovely video which was kind of inclusive. You know, I'm from Hull and Poland. I'm from Hull and Scotland. I'm from Hull and Kurdistan. I don't know if you remember that one. So Tom Courtney was reading Larkin in that one as well. So that was what it was sold on. And yet when it came to all the commissioned events and exhibitions and everything, I say there was nothing. There was one very minor Polish literature event out of the hundreds of others. And so if stories need to be told, it's those stories. You know, there's a story of the stories of language, of costume, of food, so those are those kind of cultural stories. But there's also stories of visual art, music, and you know, and sculpture, which which Hull needs to tell. It's important to do that. And as we all know, you know, race hate crime is reaching stratospheric levels in the UK and in this community. And if some public art was put in, or support was put into ethnic minority exhibitions or events celebrating that, maybe we could move those cultures into a cultural mainstream in this city, so that race hate criminals might think twice about unleashing abuse on people. I know that might be quite, I don't know, controversial thing to say, but I think it's absolutely important, and I don't think enough is being done. And certainly, City of Culture did nothing.
I agree with that. Yeah. I mean, I'm involved. I have been involved with the Afro-Caribbean here Association, and there's HANA as well, which is Hull All Nations Alliance. So, and a lot of the ethnic communities in Hull have been attached to those organisations, and there's been an organisation called ARC, which actually had a guy working for it, an Asian guy, who was an artist, and he was trying to collect art from refugees who'd come here from Afghanistan and different places. They also had a Russian woman at HANA who created art, and actually the fashion show, that was something that has managed to encompass. HANA used to put on an international football tournament, and they also put on an international fashion show. So this is not art that goes in galleries, but it's art that is produced, and also music as well. So there's been several musicians, and they used to have an event called Gig in the Park, which used to feature lots of musicians from all over the world, from, you know, India, Afghanistan. We had a world-class violinist here from, where was he from, Richard?
Narrow.
He's gone back.
He's Kurdish.
He's gone back to Kurdistan now, because he was an international leader of this orchestra, you know, in Kurdistan. But he came here as a refugee, and we've had these. But it's how to, you know, often it's how to give people a platform. You know, this is one of the political issues, is there is no international gallery here, even though we have an international collection of people from different, you know, from all over the world. So they're considered community charities. So that's how it's working, you know, because HANA is here to help people with immigration problems as well. And Hull has been the recipient of a lot of refugees, because it's, you know, they've tried to disperse people rather than just put them in London, Birmingham, Leeds, big cities, you know, to try and lessen the pressure of the, you know, the issues when you get a large amount of people coming to a particular place. Hull had an influx of 7,000 refugees a few years ago, and that was another issue because they didn't tell people. So there was a bit of a backlash against that. And then you've got the whole Polish community here, the big Polish community. And is there a Polish centre? There isn't a Polish community centre here. So, you know, there are issues about people struggling to sort of have an identity. So Poland is represented by the massive supermarkets that we've got here. So there's a different, I mean, there is scope to promote the cultures of people, and but it does take, because it always takes money to do these things, doesn't it? So it's the willingness, and there were some really good people in HANA who were based at the Community Enterprise Centre, which has now lost its place. So I'm not sure what's happening now. But the City of Culture, yes, did focus on a world thing of presenting something that paid lip service, really, to...
Did HANA have any representation in the City of Culture events?
Not really, because you see, the thing is, you've got this division, haven't you, between art and community, which sometimes a lot of people hate, doing community art because they get labeled as a community artist. And then it takes away that sort of, I don't know, but there is more of that in Hull. There's more people working in communities like the Bransholme community set on the Bransholme estate. There's a community centre there that does a lot of art with the local community. And it's just getting people like the Ferrans, because they're booked up years ahead, because they're they are the official gallery in Hull, to actually allow their gallery to be used for people that are not full-time artists. They're community artists, or they're more political artists. It would be great if the Ferrans allowed itself to be taken over by the radical artists of Hull. That would be an interesting thing. But then again, Hull is considered a poor city, so it has to keep itself, I suppose, in the international public eye. And but that is it, decolonizing the Ferrans, like just saying, can we have the Ferrans and empty it of all the stuff they've got now, put it all in the vaults, and we fill it with local artists, local artists from all the communities in Hull. I think that would be a good, I've never thought of that before, of asking for that, you see, because you think the Ferrans, it's untouchable, but actually it's the only big gallery we've got in Hull. So, because we haven't got, there's Art Link. But again, that has more of a corporate identity, even though it's, so there's those sorts of issues, actually, yeah. We need a radical arts movement in Hull, actually. Radical group of artists.
That would be a very good thing. Very welcome. I think some of the things you were saying do speak to Irene's very trenchant point about funding bids using ethnic communities, and academic research projects too. And as an academic, I mean, I have to sort of put my hands up as being available for that charge, but similarly, this is where we are. I think there is the agenda of decolonizing the humanities is a really interesting factor in all of this, because it does seem to be one of the key narratives and discussion points in universities. But there's a question, to use Glynis's phrase, the extent to which it's lip service, that it's actually happening in a broader, genuine sense of something which is an equivalent of emptying the Ferrans and really repopulating it. University courses are sort of talking about that, but it's sort of the question is, well, where do you go? Do you still teach the great white authors and artists, and just sort of bring a few more black artists into it? So it does seem like it's a very tense discussion point, but it is important to directly address it. Has anyone got any further thoughts on that, about the idea of sort of communities being used by external figures more generally? Irene, that seems a really interesting point. It'd be great if you could sort of just develop it.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I don't think that I have visited Ferencz Gallery. I really like it. I understand that, of course, there's always the funding problem, etc. But I don't think that there are no artists from various backgrounds that have not created equally great art to be included there. And the same with scholarship. I mean, we don't do a favor to anyone. I mean, in my field at least, I have read great work, and I'm not including them because, you know, this decolonization. I mean, I was including them including scholarship in my work before that because it was good scholarship. I mean, that's the point. And it is not that a Ferenc gallery will be empty. I mean, if they don't have the space to host all arts, they can have, you know, rotating exhibitions. This month, this exhibition, next month, another exhibition. I really don't see any problem. All artistic spaces have the same issue with, let's say, how many artworks can we host in each event, but they can resolve it. And the problem is just, you know, I think a problem of design and all the values that let's say, underline the design of an exhibition or an artistic event. And the same is for the stories, like you presented the artwork, and, you know, I mean, for me, it makes sense, you know, art will show the struggles that exist in a society and all the contradictions and conflicts. And if the art is not showing this, it will not be interesting and no one will care about it. And this happens in all societies. So I mean, it comes of its own. So for me, I don't think that in Hull, if you ask me about Hull, it's a much better place to do this than other places. So in Hull, and I'm so happy to have lived here. At least the museums are not, you know, this colonial pride, you know, colonial pride exhibition that has ravaged other places. At least this is not how the Hull communities, the local people, have created their spaces. And of course they can do better. So I mean, you don't need to debate whether they have something. I mean, they don't need to return, you know, the whole exhibits, you know, the whole exhibition of a museum like the British Museum. I mean, the British Museum has collections that they do not belong there anyway. So I don't see any problem for Hull. If you ask me about Hull, I don't see any problem for Hull. I think that the local people would be very positive to see those changes. And it's also a matter of class. I think that the City of Culture also let deprived communities without any funding, even if they were, let's say, of white background or, you know, living in Britain for many decades. They also left them without any funding and support. So this is a complaint that I have received through my research here. So it seems that there is also a lot of class disparity in terms of artistic, which art is considered art and which will be promoted through the funding that the city receives.
Thank you very much. Yeah, but there's quite a lot going on there. Anyone want to respond? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for. Sorry, Richard, I'll just be quick.
That's all right.
There's a lot of scope at the moment because Hull is full of empty shops. So there are attempts to sort of like create places where you can actually take them over for a nominal fee and use them as exhibition spaces. So I think the Hull is actually quite, it's much more accessible than a lot of places because it is wanting to promote the city. So anyone that has ideas, I think it is a problem though, getting to the, you know, the class issue and the fact that art is being marginalized in schools and things like that. So there's quite a lot of stuff to get over, but it's also about promoting other forms of art as well, as not just visual arts, but dance and music and theatre as well, because there's all those going on as well. So there's a lot of other stuff apart from just visual arts and painting going on, and I think that you know, that's pretty good here in Hull.
Thank you, and Richard.
I mean, Irene, yeah. Irene was saying about class, I mean, my experience is that in Hull and probably generally is that the arts world is a very middle class world. I mean, one example is what's happening. I think absolutely culturally involved in this is that we've got in where I live, HU5, and I think Glynis lives HU5 as well. We've got the Walk of Art. Now you're involved in it, Glynis, which is great. From my point of view, it does reflect on the fact that this is quite a well-off area. There are no walks of art in Bransholm, say, or in other parts of Hull, and it's about it seems to me quite genteel, quite middle class, about selling product. I don't know what you feel about being a participant, Glynis, but yeah, go on.
I'll just say that because I'm not from Hull originally. I'm from, well, originally Great Yarmouth actually, but and despite my accent, I'm actually working class. Well, I came from a working class background, but I was fostered, so there's there's all that of my history. And when I came to Hull, I was living in Springbank actually. I got a flat in Springbank, and actually I found that because I'm getting older and I wanted to live somewhere that was more peaceful. So I managed to find somewhere. I'm in a flat. I don't own my own house, so I'm in a flat where it was the same price as my housing association flat in Springbank. But for me, it is. But what I'd also like to say is, in Hull during the lockdown, there's been lots of buy and sell websites set up because everybody is suffering financially and everybody has a lot of stuff in their houses sometimes. So there's been a lot of groups set up, which it may have been led by the Avenues to start with, to get people to put stuff outside their house and have a giant jumble sale around the city. And that has happened in different areas in the city, not just in HU5. So it's happened in other areas. So that idea has sort of spread about, because a lot of people are suffering financially at the moment. So it is about being able to have an opportunity to sell stuff outside your house. Because I haven't got a car, for instance, so I can't go to a car boot and do it that way. So I think, yeah, and yes, it is a different part of the city, but I wouldn't say, coming from London, where you have loads of areas that were really run down, and I lived in Peckham and places like that, which weren't necessarily very upmarket, but it's coming to Hull, the greener areas in Hull are actually in the poorer bits, like the Bransholm area, which isn't necessarily a poor area anymore. You've got the estates, but you've also got newer areas as well. So I think Hull City Council is trying to make the whole city a bit more because, for instance, they've got really nice new buildings down in Bransholm. They've built new schools around the city. So they're trying to equalize that sense of, oh, this is a better area than that area, if you see what I mean, and trying to promote. And I certainly, coming to Hull, have always been positive about promoting all of Hull, because I think certain areas in parts of the city are really beautiful, and they're much more sort of into growing food and things like that, because we've also got the climate change issue to look at as well. And I think there's a lot of art actually being produced that's around that at the moment. There's lots of campaigns. We've had lots of issues around fracking and, issues around environmental issues that we've had to fight. And that's where the artists in Hull and the radical communists or left people have really pushed that agenda, because even the Black Lives Matter agenda in Hull has been pushed by the white, but often by a lot of the white people here, which I think is brilliant. So when you go to a Black Lives Matter here, march here, it's a whole spectrum of the whole community, because actually Black people are much more reticent to go to events, especially refugee people, where you might suffer an attack, you know, because the police obviously attend these events as well. So it's, you know, so it's really good that there is the whole community behind, and there is a radical core in Hull that really pushes these issues. And the art that will come out of all this, I think will be very interesting. But I think at the moment, everybody's trying to sort of survive through the pandemic. But we've got a weekend this weekend that is about culture. So that's really good. And there's lots of people involved in that.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's so much going on, well, in terms of what we were talking about, and but the ideas as well. It's really, it's been really just educational for me to listen and talk to you, and the responses to the material have just been totally fascinating. So I really thank you very much for all of you for that. It's been great and like a really fascinating conversation, which just looks at, you know, what is clearly by its nature it's just a phase of a story which how come we don't know, but it's whether people talk about it or not seems to be, and I think there's so many fascinating things being discussed, but it's also so important. I don't know, I find it so important to just you know, every now and again just check the headlines of the overwhelming right-wing press in this country where it comes to culture and culture wars, to get a sense of just what is at stake here. And if someone in the universities just feel this sense of how what we're doing is there's an agenda here, and it's happening in culture, it's happening in education everywhere. And whilst these sort of, you know, debates are very, very complex by their nature, it is really, they're so important. So it's been very, very good to talk to you.